The wind in Red Valley had a taste. It was the flavor of rust and time, scraped from the high red bluffs that held the town in a thirsty embrace. It carried the scent of sagebrush and the fine, gritty dust that settled on everything, coating window panes and the tongues of men. The year was 1878, and the drought had its teeth in the Wyoming Territory. The sun was a hammer, beating the parched earth until it cracked. Cattle stood hip-shot and miserable in the heat, their ribs like washboards under their hides. Only at night did the town seem to draw a full breath, when the oil lamps of the Red Garter Saloon spilled a greasy yellow light onto the main street, a welcome beacon for the wagon trains that paused here before the long, hard push across the Black Hills. Nora Quinn felt the grit between her teeth. She had been in town for 2 days, and already the dust felt like a permanent part of her. At 26, she was a woman who had learned to measure her life in careful steps, a habit ingrained a year ago when a runaway carriage had splintered, leaving her with a left leg that would never again keep perfect time with her right. The limp was slight, a gentle hesitation in her gait, but in a world that valued strength and speed, it was a flaw some people could not see past. She was a former railroad telegrapher, her mind quick and her fingers nimble, capable of pulling sense from the chaotic chatter of the wires. She had come to Red Valley with a simple, fierce goal to get the telegrapher's job at the post office and save enough money to buy back the small house her mother had left behind in Montana. It was a quiet dream, but it was hers, and it had carried her this far. She walked toward the post office, her hand brushing the worn fabric of her skirt. The building was little more than a wood-frame box with a sagging porch, but inside it held the key to her future. The postmaster, a man with a stained vest and a face like a wilted cabbage, barely looked up from his paperwork. He listened to her request, his eyes flicking once to her face, then down to her feet. He grunted. "The last man quit," said the quiet drove him mad. "I do not mind the quiet," Nora said, her voice even. "I am proficient in Morse and can handle commercial and private traffic." The man leaned back, the chair groaning in protest. He stroked his chin, his gaze lingering on the slight unevenness of her posture. "This job requires speed. Miss Quinn, fetching mail bags, sorting parcels. It's a physical job." "I am strong," she said. It was a simple truth. The accident had taken a piece of her body's grace, but it had forged a resilience in its place. "It is not about strength," the postmaster said, a note of finality in his voice. "It is about appearance. We are a federal service. We must appear capable. A woman who limps, it does not inspire confidence." The words were not cruel, not exactly. They were worse. They were casual, a simple statement of fact as he saw it. The dismissal was as impersonal as the dust settling on his desk. Humiliation burned hot in Nora's chest, a familiar and unwelcome fire. She nodded, her pride a stiff wall against the sting of his prejudice. "I see. Thank you for your time." She turned and walked out, her limp feeling more pronounced under the weight of his judgment. The sun was blinding. She paused on the porch, blinking, refusing to let the tears that pricked her eyes fall. Her gaze fell on the public notice board tacked to the wall. It was a mess of land claims, wanted posters, and advertisements. Among them was a freshly pinned telegram, its yellow paper stark against the weathered wood. It was tacked up carelessly, likely by a boy who did not know the difference between a private wire and a public notice. Nora's eyes scanned the message, and a lifetime of habit took over. The rhythmic clusters of dots and dashes were as natural to her as spoken words. Her mind translated the coded message without conscious thought. "Our farm equip Whitman's Ford Fry Eve 9 stop confirm Pike stop Carnes." Farm equipment. The sender was Silas Carnes, a name she had already learned in her 2 days in town. Carnes owned the freight company, the warehouse, and from the talk she had heard, he owned the town's leash. The message was coded, a simple substitution cipher she had seen the railroad use for valuable shipments. But why code a message about farm equipment? And why was it posted for all the world to see? Her mind worked quickly. Farm equipment was heavy, bulky. It was the perfect disguise for something else. Something valuable enough to require a coded message and a confirmation from someone named Pike. Something like gold. She committed the message to memory and walked away from the post office, the dry wind doing little to cool the flush on her cheeks. The rejection still stung, but now it was mixed with a new, dangerous current of knowledge. From across the street, leaning against the shaded wall of the blacksmith's forge, a man watched her go. Caleb Hart, the ranger, saw the straightness of her back as she left the post office, a posture that defied the slight falter in her step. He had seen that kind of pride before, in soldiers who refused to admit they were wounded. At 32, Caleb's eyes were accustomed to seeing what lay beneath the surface. As a territorial ranger, his job was to read the land, to track men who did not want to be found, and to keep a fragile peace. He was known to be a man who rarely missed his shot, but hated to pull the trigger. The Civil War had taught him the cost of noise and violence, and a brutal ambush in '76 had reinforced the lesson in blood. He carried the memory of it in the quiet watchfulness of his gaze and the way he preferred the silence of the high country to the clamor of towns. He knew Silas Carnes and his slick enforcer, Willie Pike. And he knew Sheriff Weller was a man who policed the town by looking the other way whenever Carnes's shadow fell across the law. Caleb watched Nora Quinn walk down the street, a flicker of interest cutting through his usual reserve. She did not look like trouble, but in Red Valley, trouble had a way of finding the most unlikely people. That evening, the Red Garter Saloon was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and sawdust. The piano player hammered out a tune that was more rhythm than melody, a frantic backdrop to the low growl of conversation and the clink of glasses. Nora stood behind the bar, an apron tied around her waist, her hands submerged in a bucket of murky water. The saloon owner, a man named Henderson, had offered her the job washing glasses until something better came along. It was humbling work, but it was work. It would keep her in town. Across the room, Silas Carnes held court at his usual table, a large, thick-necked man whose expensive suit could not hide the brutish set of his shoulders. With him was Willie Pike, a man so thin and pale he looked as if he had been assembled from bone and wire. His smile was a bloodless slash in his face. Sheriff Weller sat with them, laughing a little too loudly at whatever Carnes had said, his badge a dull spot of brass on his chest. Nora worked methodically, her mind a world away, replaying the coded message. Farm equipment to Whitman's Ford. Friday. She pictured the map in her head. The shallow crossing on the Powder River. It was a secluded spot, perfect for a clandestine transfer. She scrubbed at a stubborn spot on a glass, lost in thought, and murmured aloud to herself, the words barely a whisper. All that farm equipment, going all the way to Whitman's Ford on a Friday? It was a mistake. The saloon was loud, but not loud enough. A burly freighter standing near the bar turned his head, his eyes narrowing. He was one of Carnes's men. He had not heard her clearly, but he had heard something. He took a step closer. "What was that you said, girl?" Nora's blood ran cold. She looked up, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Before she could answer, a shadow fell over her. A man was standing beside her, his back to the freighter. She had not seen him approach. He was tall and lean, dressed in buckskin and denim, with a quietness about him that seemed to push back against the saloon's noise. It was the ranger, Caleb Hart. He nodded at her, his expression calm. "Sorry to be talking your ear off, ma'am." He raised his voice just enough to be heard by the freighter. "As I was saying, that new plow shipment is a godsend for the folks upriver." He looked at Nora, his eyes holding hers for a brief, significant moment. "If anyone asks, just say I was telling you a long, boring story about farming." The freighter grunted, his suspicion fading, and turned back to his beer. Nora let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She looked at the ranger, a question in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice low. Caleb simply nodded and moved away, melting back into the shadows at the edge of the room. He had understood immediately. He knew she had stumbled into something dangerous, and he had offered her a shield without a single wasted word. But the moment had not gone unnoticed. From his table, Willie Pike had seen the exchange. He had seen the freighter's interest, and he had seen the ranger's quiet intervention. He leaned toward his boss. "That new girl," Pike said, his voice a dry rasp. "The one with the limp. I think she knows something about the Friday shipment." Silas Carnes stopped swirling the whiskey in his glass. He looked over at Nora, his eyes cold and assessing. He saw a woman working a menial job, a woman with a physical imperfection. He saw someone he considered weak, someone easily managed. "Is that so?" Carnes said. More a statement than a question. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Well then, go have a word with her. Offer to buy her silence, a train ticket out of town, a few dollars for her trouble. If that does not work," he paused, setting the glass down with a soft click, "then you will have to teach her some manners." Later that night, long after the last drunk had been pushed out into the street, Nora stood in the small, stuffy room she had rented above the general store. The saloon job had been exhausting. Her leg ached, and the smell of stale beer seemed to have seeped into her skin. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror. She saw the weariness in her eyes, but beneath it, something else was taking root. For the past year, since the accident, she had been running. She had run from the pity in people's eyes, from the whispers behind her back, from the constant, painful reminders of what she had lost. She had come to Red Valley looking for a quiet life, a chance to rebuild. Instead, she had found Silas Carnes and a secret whispered over the telegraph wires. She thought of the postmaster's casual dismissal and the freighter's menacing stare. She thought of the ranger's quiet, unexpected act of protection. The town had already shown her its teeth. The easy thing, the sensible thing, would be to leave on the morning stagecoach. But as she looked at her own reflection, a stubborn resolve settled over her. She had spent a year letting her injury define her, letting it make her cautious and quiet. She had allowed it to make her run. Not anymore. She touched the side of her left shoe, where the sole was slightly more worn than the right. "I have been running for a year," she whispered to the tired woman in the mirror. "But a limp in my step does not mean my heart has to crawl." Red Valley was a hard place, but Nora Quinn had decided she was done running. She would stay. She would keep washing glasses, and she would watch, and she would listen. Her limp might slow her walk, but she had a feeling she was about to arrive exactly where she needed to be. The days in Red Valley settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the dust. Life spilled out onto the single main street, a daily pageant of survival. At dawn, the market stalls went up, offering dusty potatoes, slabs of bacon, and bolts of calico. The clank of the blacksmith's hammer was the town's heartbeat. Women gathered by the creek, their chatter rising with the steam from their laundry pots, their hands raw from lye soap. Red dust, fine as flour, settled on every porch rail and windowsill, a constant reminder of the land's thirst. It was a place where strength was currency and weakness was a liability. Gossip traveled faster than a horse, and a person's reputation was built or broken in the space between a whisper and a sidelong glance. Nora learned the town's currents as she learned the smudges on the saloon's glasses. She saw the ranchers' wives haggle fiercely for a sack of beans, their face etched with worry. She saw the weary optimism of prospectors heading for the hills, their eyes already glittering with the gold they had yet to find. And she saw the ever-present shadow of Silas Carnes, whose freight wagons rumbled through town like ironclad beasts, a constant display of his power. She saw the ranger, Caleb Hart, too. He was a quiet fixture, often seen at the edge of town, checking the cinch on his saddle or simply watching the horizon, his gaze distant. He moved with a purpose that wasted no motion. One afternoon, as she was sweeping the saloon's porch, he rode past. He reined in his horse and looked down at her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Mr. Hart," she replied, leaning on her broom. "Or should I call you the Silent Ranger?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, not quite reaching his eyes. Silence does not waste words. "Miss Quinn." "And I suppose words are in short supply. Like the rain," she countered, a spark of her old wit returning. "Some are," he said, his gaze steady. "The important ones are not." He gave a slight tip of his hat and rode on, leaving Nora with the strange feeling that they had said much more than their few words implied. The sky had been a pale, hazy blue all morning, the air unnervingly still. By mid-afternoon, the stillness broke. A low moan started in the west, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sky turned a sickly yellow-brown. A wall of dust, a monstrous, churning cloud, was rolling toward Red Valley. "Sandstorm!" someone yelled. The street dissolved into chaos. People scrambled for cover, dragging children and chickens with them. Nora was inside the saloon, finishing her shift. When the first gust hit, the building shuddered. Sand, as fine as needle points, blasted through the cracks in the walls. Henderson, the owner, was wrestling with the swinging doors, trying to bar them against the wind's fury. Through the swirling dust, Nora saw Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who lived in a small shack at the edge of town, struggling against the wind. The old woman was trying to hold on to the porch railing of the assayer's office, but the wind was tearing at her, threatening to throw her into the street. The porch roof, old and rotten, was groaning, its supports beginning to splinter. Without a second thought, Nora pushed past Henderson and ran outside. The wind was a physical force, stealing her breath and blinding her with grit. She fought her way toward the old woman, her limp a frustrating anchor in the gale. Just as she reached the porch, Caleb Hart was there, seemingly appearing out of the brown chaos. He had his arm around Mrs. Gable, shielding her with his body. "Get back inside," he yelled at Nora over the roar of the wind. "The roof is going to collapse," she shouted back, pointing at the groaning timbers above them. He saw it, too, with a powerful heave. He pulled Mrs. Gable away from the railing. Nora grabbed the old woman's other arm, adding her own strength. Together, they half dragged, half carried her away from the building. Seconds later, with a sound like a gunshot, the porch roof tore loose and crashed to the ground in a cloud of splinters and dust. They stumbled into the relative safety of the saloon just as Henderson finally managed to slam the bar across the doors. Inside, the air was thick with dust and fear. Mrs. Gable was gasping for breath, her face pale. Caleb helped her into a chair. Nora, her hair and clothes caked with red dirt, felt a stinging sensation on her cheek. She touched it, and her fingers came away with a smear of blood where a piece of flying debris had grazed her. Later, after the storm had blown itself out, leaving the town buried under a fresh blanket of red, Henderson cornered Nora by the bar. "You see," he said, his voice gruff, "this is what I was talking about. A woman with a limp, running around in a storm. It is a liability. You stick to washing glasses. You understand, I will not have you trying to serve drinks and tripping all over the place." His words were a slap. Nearby, a group of freighters who had been drinking since the storm passed snickered. One of them, a man with a greasy beard, spoke loudly to his friends. "That is the one Pike was talking about. The limping girl who can read coded messages." They laughed, the sound coarse and cruel. Nora turned away, the familiar burn of shame rising in her throat. The cut on her cheek stung, but the mockery hurt more. She remembered the day she was fired from the railroad telegraph office. A storm had taken down a section of the line, and the superintendent had told her, "This is no place for a woman. We need men who can handle emergencies." Not a female operator who will panic when the lines go dead. She had not panicked. She had stayed at her post for 36 hours, rerouting traffic and coordinating repair crews. But her competence had not mattered. Only her gender had. Now, it was her leg. It was always something. She looked up and caught Caleb Hart's eye in the bar mirror. He was standing by the door. Watching, he had seen the whole exchange. He did not step forward, did not say a word in her defense. He simply held her gaze for a moment, then gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not pity. It was acknowledgement. It was a silent message that said, "I see you. I see your strength." The gesture was small, but it was enough to bank the fires of her anger and humiliation. He was respecting her enough to let her fight her own battles, but letting her know she was not alone. The next day, Willie Pike found her. She was shaking a dusty rug behind the saloon when he stepped out of the alley, blocking her path. His smile was as thin as a razor's edge. "Miss Quinn," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "I have a business proposition for you." Nora stood her ground, the rug held in front of her like a shield. "I am not looking for business. Mr. Pike." "Everyone is looking for business," he said, stepping closer. "Mr. Carnes is a generous man. He understands that a young woman like yourself might find Red Valley inhospitable. He has authorized me to offer you this." He held out a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins, "and a stagecoach ticket, enough to get you to Cheyenne, and a little extra to start fresh. All we ask in return is that you forget any interesting things you might have read or heard since you arrived." It was exactly as Caleb's warning had implied. They wanted to buy her silence. They thought she was weak, someone who could be bought and sent away. Nora looked from the pouch to Pike's face. She let a small, cool smile touch her own lips. "Mr. Pike, I appreciate the offer, but my memory is not for sale." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "I sell words. I do not sell my silence." Pike's smile vanished. His eyes turned to chips of ice. "That is a foolish choice, Miss Quinn. A very foolish choice." He turned and walked away, his lean frame disappearing back into the alley. Miles away, in a shallow arroyo carved by a forgotten creek, Caleb Hart knelt beside a set of wagon tracks. He was not looking at the depth of the ruts or the breed of the horses. He was looking at the nails in the iron tires. The blacksmith Carnes used, a man named Peters, had a habit of using a distinctive cross-headed nail on all his heavy freight wagons. It was his signature, as unique as a brand. Caleb had found the tracks leading away from the main trail, heading toward the secluded crossing at Whitman's Ford. They were heavy tracks, dug deep into the earth, far too heavy for a standard load of farm equipment. He scraped away the dry soil with his knife. Gold was heavy. So were rifles and ammunition. Carnes was not just building a commercial empire. He was building a private army. When Nora returned to her small room that evening, she found a small clay pot sitting on her windowsill. Inside was a dark, fragrant salve. There was no note. She knew who it was from. The next morning, she went looking for the sender. She found her on the outskirts of town, in a small cabin surrounded by a garden of herbs she did not recognize. Mary Two Feathers was a Lakota woman whose age was impossible to guess. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, and her eyes held a deep, knowing calm. She was tending her plants when Nora approached. "The ranger said you were scraped by the wind," Mary said, her voice soft but clear. She did not ask. She stated, "Thank you for the medicine," Nora said, touching her cheek where the cut was already beginning to heal. "It is very kind." Mary looked at her, her gaze drifting down to Nora's leg, to the slight hesitation in her walk. "The wound on your face will heal and leave no mark. It is the other wounds, the ones that change how you walk, that teach the most important lessons." Nora stood silently, surprised by the woman's directness. Mary continued, her hands gently pruning a sage bush. "Your leg teaches you to walk to the rhythm of your own heart. not to the crack of someone else's whip. Do not curse it. Listen to what it tells you. The words settled deep inside Nora, a balm on an older, more private wound than the one on her cheek. She left Mary's cabin feeling as if a weight had been lifted, a new perspective settling into place. That night, in the quiet of her room, she took out a small piece of paper. With a stub of a pencil, she carefully wrote down the decoded message, "Arrive farm equipment, Whitman's Ford, Friday evening at 9. Confirm Pike, Carnes." She read it over one last time. The words, a dangerous secret. She needed to hide it, to keep it safe. Her gaze fell on her worn leather shoes sitting by the door. An idea, born of Mary's words, took shape. Her limp, her weakness, the very thing the world used to define and dismiss her. She folded the small piece of paper into a tight square. She lifted her left shoe, the one that met the ground with a little less certainty than the right. She carefully slipped the paper under the worn insole, pushing it deep into the toe. She put the shoe back on. It felt no different, but now it carried a weight far greater than leather and thread. Her weakness had become her vault. The limp that was meant to hold her back was now the very thing that would carry her forward, one determined, uneven step at a time. The safe was walking now. It was on Friday, late in the afternoon, when the sun was bleeding a fiery orange across the western bluffs, that Caleb Hart found Nora sweeping the saloon porch. The air was cooling, carrying the promise of a clear, cold night. He stood for a moment, just outside the spill of lamplight, a tall, quiet shape against the deepening twilight. "Miss Quinn," he said, his voice just loud enough to cut through the chirping of the crickets. She stopped sweeping and looked at him. In the fading light, his face was all angles and shadows, his eyes holding their usual steady watchfulness. "Mr. Hart, out for an evening stroll?" "Something like that," he said. He gestured with his head toward the open country beyond the town's last building. "The air is clearer out past the stockyards. I thought you might appreciate a walk that did not involve the smell of stale beer." It was not an invitation for a courtship stroll. His tone was level, practical, but there was an unspoken question in his gaze. He was offering her a choice. Nora leaned her broom against the wall, a silent acceptance. She knew this was not about fresh air. This was about Whitman's Ford. They walked without speaking, leaving the noise and the light of Red Valley behind them. Nora was acutely aware of the different rhythms of their steps, her own slight hesitation, his long, even stride. Yet he matched his pace to hers without making it obvious, a small, unspoken courtesy that she appreciated more than words. Once they were clear of the town, under a vast, star-dusted sky, Caleb stopped. He pointed to a set of tracks in the dirt, almost invisible in the gloom. "You see that?" he asked. "The right front hoof of that horse is shot a little heavy. The smith likely did not file it down properly. It makes the print on that side a fraction deeper. A man in a hurry would not notice. A man trying to hide his trail would not think to fix it." He was not just taking her for a walk. He was giving her a lesson. He showed her how a broken twig could tell you which way a man had gone, how the spacing of tracks could reveal if a horse was tired or fresh. He was showing her his world, the silent language of the land. They were not a ranger and a saloon girl. They were partners, preparing for the night's work. Whitman's Ford was a shallow crossing where the Powder River widened and slowed, whispering over a bed of smooth, dark stones. A sliver of a crescent moon hung in the sky, casting just enough light to turn the water's surface to polished silver and the surrounding cottonwoods into black, skeletal shapes. Caleb led her to a thicket of willows on a low rise overlooking the ford. From there, they had a clear view of the crossing and the trail on either side. "They will come from the south," he said, his voice a low murmur that was swallowed by the sound of the river. "And they will be expecting to meet someone on the other side." They settled in to wait. The night air grew colder, and Nora pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The silence was immense. broken only by the river's song and the occasional call of a night bird. It was a peaceful place for such a dangerous meeting. Nora took a small notebook and a pencil from her pocket, her tools as ready as the Colt revolver Caleb wore on his hip. She was a telegrapher, and her instinct was to record, to document. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher. Just as Nora was beginning to think their intelligence was wrong, she heard the distant, rhythmic creak of a heavy wagon, the jingle of harnesses. A few minutes later, the lumbering shape of a freight wagon, pulled by a team of 4 powerful mules, emerged from the darkness and started down the gentle slope to the river. Caleb put a hand on her arm, a silent signal to stay perfectly still. From their vantage point, they could not see the men's faces clearly, but he did not need to. He watched the surface of the river. As the wagon and its escort moved into the moonlight, their dark shapes were reflected perfectly in the still water. 5 of them, Caleb whispered, his eyes never leaving the scene below. 2 on the wagon, 3 on horseback. Nora's eyes were fixed on the wagon itself. The large wooden crates were covered by a canvas tarp, but one corner had come loose, flapping in the breeze. In the faint moonlight, she could just make out a stenciled symbol on the side of a crate. She sketched it quickly in her notebook. As the wagon trundled through the shallow water, the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. And then, a tickle started in Nora's nose. She tried to suppress it, pressing a finger under her nostrils, but it was no use. A small, sharp sneeze escaped her. Achoo! The sound was tiny, almost lost in the gurgle of the river, but in the profound silence of the night, it sounded to Nora like a cannon shot. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Below, one of the outriders reined in his horse, his head turning in their direction. Caleb did not move a muscle. He leaned close to her, his breath warm against her ear. "Bless you," he whispered, his voice laced with an unexpected, dry humor. "Save me the trouble of a recount." Nora shot him a sideways glance, a mixture of terror and exasperation. "You are a true ranger," she whispered back fiercely. "You can probably count all the way to 1. The rider below seemed to decide the sound was just a night creature and urged his horse forward. The crisis passed, but Willie Pike, who was riding point, was more cautious. He dismounted and walked back toward the spot where he thought he had heard the sound. He scanned the ground, his eyes sharp. He was too far away to see them in the willows, but he was getting closer. His gaze fell upon the patch of soft earth where Nora had stumbled slightly as they climbed the rise. He knelt, and even from a distance, they could see him pause. He had found her footprint. "Stay here," Caleb breathed, and then he was gone, moving through the shadows with a fluid silence that was unnerving. Pike stood up, drawing his revolver, and started toward the willows. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She watched, helpless, as he advanced. Then she saw a flicker of movement to Pike's right. A loop of rope snaked out of the darkness, silent and precise. It settled over Pike's shoulders, and before he could even cry out, the rope went taut. Caleb pulled, using Pike's own momentum against him. Pike was yanked off his feet and landed with a heavy, wet splash in the muddy shallows of the river. His gun flew from his hand and disappeared into the water. The other riders shouted in alarm, spinning their horses around. But Caleb was already gone, having melted back into the deeper shadows upstream. There were no gunshots, no loud confrontation, just a silent, efficient removal of the immediate threat. The remaining men, confused and unnerved, decided against a search in the dark. They retrieved a sputtering, mud-soaked Pike, and with nervous glances back at the dark shoreline, urged the wagon across the ford and up the opposite bank, disappearing into the night. When the sound of the wagon had faded completely, Caleb reappeared at Nora's side. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, letting out a long, shaky breath. "I am. That was quiet. "Quiet is better," he said. He looked down at her notebook, open on her lap. "What did you get?" "A symbol," she said, her excitement overriding her fear. She showed him the sketch. "I have seen it before, at the rail yard. It is a commercial routing marker. Each freight company has its own set for different destinations. This one means the shipment is routed through Carnes's main warehouse in Cheyenne. It is commercial proof. It links this secret shipment directly to his legitimate business." Caleb looked at the symbol, then at her, a new level of respect in his eyes. "That is good work, Miss Quinn." As he spoke, a new sound reached them, a deeper, more insistent rushing from the river. The water, fed by snowmelt from a warm spell in the high country, was rising. The current was growing stronger, swirling around the rocks. "We need to go," Caleb said, taking her arm. "The river is coming up fast." They scrambled down the rise, heading for a place where the bank was less steep. The rocks near the water's edge were slick with moss and sudden moisture. Nora, hurrying to keep up, placed her left foot on a large, flat stone. It shifted under her weight. Her ankle turned, and with a small cry, she lost her balance, pitching sideways toward the churning water. In an instant, Caleb's hand shot out and clamped around her wrist. His grip was like iron. He pulled her back from the edge, his strength steadying her. For a moment, they stood there, inches apart, the cold, dark water rushing past their feet. Nora was breathless, her heart pounding from both the near fall and their sudden proximity. She could feel the warmth of his hand, the solid strength in his arm. It was a moment of pure, unadorned connection, born of shared danger and mutual reliance. There was no romance in it, only a profound sense of safety and trust. "Careful," he said, his voice low. He did not let go until she had found solid footing. They made their way back to town in silence, the events of the night settling around them. When they reached the edge of the sleeping town, Caleb stopped in the shadow of the livery stable. He unbuckled the holster of a small Colt revolver from his saddle. He handed it to her. "But first." Nora looked at the gun, then at him. "This is for your own protection," he said, his voice serious. "It is not for threatening people. You only draw it if you have no other choice. Do you understand?" She nodded, her fingers closing around the cool, weighted grip of the gun. It was a heavy burden, a heavy trust. It was his way of saying he believed in her, that he considered her an equal in this dangerous game. Their return did not go unnoticed. A light was on in the sheriff's office, and a man smoking a late-night cigarette on the hotel porch watched them walk down the main street together. By morning, the gossip was buzzing through town like a trapped fly. The quiet ranger and the limping saloon girl, seen coming in from the prairie in the dead of night. Henderson, the saloon owner, was waiting for her when she arrived for work. "I heard you were out gallivanting all night," he said, his lips thin with disapproval. "This is a respectable establishment. I will not have my employees earning a bad name. You can work a double shift tonight, washing every pot and pan in this place, to make up for the damage to my reputation." Later that day, Sheriff Weller saw Caleb leaving the general store. He pushed himself off the wall he was leaning on and sauntered over, a smirk on his face. "Well now, Ranger," Weller said, his voice oozing insinuation, "I hear you have taken to keeping company with the saloon help, finding the nights a little lonely out on the trail." Caleb stopped and faced him. His expression did not change, but his eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. "That woman," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made Weller's smirk falter, "can read Morse code faster than you can write a parking fine. You would do well to remember that." He turned and walked away, leaving the sheriff standing speechless in the dust. The true blow, however, came that evening. A stable boy who sometimes ran errands for Caleb came to the saloon with a hurried message. He had overheard Willie Pike talking to one of Carnes's teamsters. The incident at the ford had made them nervous. They were not waiting for the next scheduled shipment, a much larger wagon, the real one, was being loaded now. They were moving it out tomorrow night, a full 24 hours ahead of schedule. Nora felt a chill go through her. Their small victory at the ford had been a warning shot. Now, Carnes was accelerating his plans. The timeline had collapsed. The stakes had just been raised, and the clock was ticking faster than ever. The news hit them like a physical blow. 24 hours. The window of opportunity they thought they had was being slammed shut. There was no time to gather more witnesses, no time to send for a federal marshal. Carnes was making his move, and by the time the sun set the next day, the evidence would be gone, scattered on the trail to Cheyenne. That night, they met in the deep shadows behind the livery stable, the air smelling of hay and horsehide. The moon was a little fuller than it had been at the ford, casting enough light to see the grim set of Caleb's jaw. "The warehouse," Nora said, her voice a low, determined whisper. It was not a question. It was the only logical, impossible answer. The real ledgers have to be there, the ones that match the coded shipments. "It is a fortress, Nora," Caleb said. "He has a watchman, and the locks are from back east. Best money can buy." "The railroad used the same locks on their payroll offices," she replied, a flicker of the old telegrapher's confidence in her eyes. "I know them. The tumblers have a flaw. They stick if you apply the right pressure." She held up her hands. They were hands made for the delicate work of a telegraph key, not a lockpick, but they were steady. He studied her for a long moment in the silvered darkness. He was a man who planned every move, who weighed every risk. This was reckless. It was also their only chance. "The watchman takes a meal at the saloon just after midnight," he said, his voice resigned. "It gives us maybe 20 minutes. Just after midnight." The main street of Red Valley was a ghost town. The only light came from a single lamp left burning in the saloon and the distant, indifferent stars. Caleb and Nora moved through the back alleys, their steps muffled by the thick dust. The warehouse loomed before them, a great, dark block of a building, silent and imposing. The air inside was cold and still, a cavern of shadows that smelled of raw pine from new crates, the sharp bite of coal dust, and the faint, clean scent of pine oil used to treat the wood. A single moonbeam lanced through a high, grimy window, illuminating a universe of floating dust motes. Caleb stood guard by the door, a silhouette against the lesser dark of the night, while Nora went to work on the door of the small office built into one corner of the vast space. She knelt, her tools a set of fine metal picks she had fashioned from a lady's hairpins and a bit of wire. She inserted the tension wrench, applying a gentle, steady pressure. Then she began to probe the lock with a pick, her touch as delicate as a surgeon's. She could feel the faint, grating vibrations of the pins. 1, 2, 3. The fourth was stubborn, just as she had expected. She adjusted the tension, her brow furrowed in concentration, listening with her fingertips. There was a faint, almost inaudible click as the tumbler finally gave way. The lock turned. The office was cramped, dominated by a heavy oak desk. And on the desk were the ledgers. There were 2 of them. One was thick, bound in handsome green leather, its pages filled with neat columns of legitimate cargo flour, salt, textiles, tools. The other was smaller, bound in plain black cardboard, its pages filled with hurried, cryptic entries. Nora opened the black book. There it was. A column of dates, a column of cargo descriptions, always something mundane like farm equipment or mining supplies, and a third column of symbols, the same routing markers she had sketched at the ford. She took out her own small notebook and began to copy the dates and symbols, her pencil flying across the page. Every entry was another nail in Silas Carnes's coffin. "We have to go," Caleb's voice came from the doorway, a low warning. Nora copied one last line. She closed the ledger, placing it exactly as she had found it. She stood, her heart thumping with a mixture of fear and triumph. They had it. They had the proof. She turned, and her triumph died in her throat. A man was standing in the office doorway, blocking her exit. It was not Caleb. It was Willie Pike, and he was holding a very large revolver. Its barrel pointed directly at her chest. Behind him, she could see Caleb on the floor, struggling to rise, a dark shape looming over him. "Well, well," Pike said, his thin smile a terrifying sight in the gloom. "Look what we have here, a little mouse in the granary." Nora's mind raced. The small coat Caleb had given her was tucked in her waistband, hidden by her skirt, but she would never be able to draw it in time. She stood perfectly still, her gaze locked on Pike. She had no weapon but her wits. "If you shoot me," she said, her voice surprisingly calm and clear, "you will have a lot of explaining to do, especially about the factory whistle." Pike's smile faltered. He took a half-step into the room. "What are you talking about?" "The steam whistle at the lumber mill," Nora said, inventing the lie as she spoke, her words precise and measured. "Mr. Hart arranged for it to blow if he was not back at a designated spot in 15 minutes. But it will not just blow once. It will blow in a pattern. A signal. A signal that means there is trouble at Carnes's warehouse. It stopped. Did you not notice 6 minutes ago? Any second now. That signal is going to sound all over town." Pike hesitated. The bluff was just plausible enough, just specific enough, to plant a seed of doubt in his mind. He glanced over his shoulder, back into the main warehouse. In that instant of distraction, a brilliant, blinding white light exploded from the far end of the building. Caleb was on his feet. Holding a signal lantern with its reflector panel slid open, the concentrated beam hit Pike square in the eyes. He cried out, throwing up a hand to shield his face, momentarily blinded. It was all the time Caleb needed. He lunged forward, not at Pike, but at the hand holding the gun. He slammed Pike's wrist against the doorframe. Bone crunched, the gun clattered to the floor, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs. Nora did not wait to watch the fight. She saw her chance. She scooped up Pike's fallen revolver and backed away as Caleb subdued the other man, a big, burly teamster. The fight was short and brutal. Caleb moved with a grim efficiency, using his weight and leverage to pin Pike to the floor. When it was over, the warehouse was silent again except for the sound of labored breathing. Caleb got to his feet, pulling a bruised and furious Pike up with him. "I should have known you were involved." "Ranger!" Pike snarled, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the dusty floor. Caleb ignored him. He looked at Nora. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, her voice a little shaky now that the danger had passed. "Are you—" He shook his head, but as he turned, she saw him wince. His sleeve was torn at the shoulder, and a dark stain was spreading across the fabric. "You are hurt," she said, stepping forward. "You hit that crate when you fell." "It is just a scratch," he said, but his face was pale. "Sit down," she ordered, with an authority that surprised them both. She tore a strip of clean cloth from her petticoat and, after pushing aside his torn sleeve, began to clean the long, ugly scrape along his shoulder. "Honestly," she muttered, her hands gentle but firm as she tied the makeshift bandage. "All that silent strength, and you are no tougher than a wooden box." A faint smile touched his lips. The box won. Their moment of quiet banter was shattered when the big warehouse doors slid open with a deafening groan, flooding the space with lantern light. Sheriff Weller stood there, flanked by two deputies, his face a mask of official outrage, and standing just behind him, looking perfectly calm and composed, was Silas Carnes. "Well, well," Weller boomed, striding forward. "Looks like we caught a couple of thieves, breaking and entering, trespassing on private property. You are both under arrest." Carnes walked past the sheriff, his eyes sweeping over the scene. He looked at Caleb, then his gaze settled on Nora, a smug, contemptuous curl to his lip. "And look here," he said, his voice dripping with false pity. "The poor limping girl, so desperate for work she has to turn to a life of crime. It is a sad thing when honest men of business are preyed upon by the desperate and the deviant." The public humiliation was his weapon of choice. Sharper than any knife, he was painting her as a pathetic criminal, a broken thing. The deputies grabbed Caleb's arms, while Weller himself took hold of Nora. As they were being led out into the cool night air, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Mary. 2 feathers. She was carrying a small bundle of herbs and a clay pot of the same salve she had given Nora before. She walked directly to Carnes, her ancient eyes holding his without a trace of fear. "This man needs medicine," she said, nodding toward Caleb. Then she looked at the sheriff. "And you should be careful who you lock in your jail. This woman has a strong heart." She turned her gaze back to Carnes. "I have spoken to my cousins who were forced to work for you at the silver mine you claim does not exist, the one on Lakota land. They will be happy to tell their story to a federal judge." Carnes's face tightened almost imperceptibly, but he held the power here. For now. He gave a curt nod to the sheriff. Weller, emboldened, shoved Nora forward. "Take her to the cells. We will sort this out in the morning." They put Nora in a small, damp cell at the back of the jail. It smelled of mildew and despair. The heavy door clanged shut, the sound final and absolute. For a long time, she just sat on the hard cot, the darkness pressing in on her. She thought of her mother and of the neat, orderly world of the telegraph office, a world of clear rules and direct communication. She had been so proud of that work, of the skill it required. She had lost it all in the space of a single, terrible afternoon when the carriage had overturned. A wave of fear washed over her, cold and sickening. But it was not a fear of the jail, or of what Carnes might do to her. It was a deeper, more insidious fear. She was afraid because for the last year, she had grown comfortable with being silent. She had let her limp and the world's reaction to it push her into a small, quiet corner. She had almost forgotten the woman she used to be, the one who was not afraid to speak her mind, to stand her ground. This, right here, was the result of that silence. "I am not afraid of this cell," she whispered into the darkness. "I am afraid because I almost came to believe this is where I belonged." In another part of the town, Caleb was also being held, but his mind was not on his own predicament. After Mary had insisted on treating his shoulder, Weller had locked him in the office. Not a cell, a small concession to his status as a ranger. He was not idle. He knew that brute force would not win this fight. He began to think about the people in town who had reason to resent Carnes. He thought of Peters, the blacksmith, who was forced to buy his coal and iron from Carnes at inflated prices. He thought of the 2 young freighters he had seen, their faces sullen as they unloaded Carnes's wagons for half the pay they deserved. These were small people, easily intimidated, but together, their voices might be heard. He could not be a lone hero. This had to be the town's fight, not just his. Later that night, Sheriff Weller walked down the street to the Red Garter Saloon. The main room was empty, but a light burned in the back office. Silas Carnes was there, counting a stack of money. He did not look up when Weller entered. "She is locked up tight," the sheriff said, a little too eagerly. "The ranger, too. They will not be causing any more trouble." Carnes finished his count and pushed a much smaller stack of bills across the table. Weller's eyes darted to it greedily. "Trouble has a way of spreading," Carnes said quietly. "Evidence can be misinterpreted. Stories can get told. I want this finished, permanently." Weller picked up the money, his palms sweating. "What do you have in mind?" "An accident," Carnes said, his voice as cold as the bottom of a well. "A terrible tragedy. An overturned lantern, perhaps. A fire at the warehouse. It will happen just before dawn. A clean slate, and by the time the smoke clears, I will be well on my way to Cheyenne." He looked at Weller, his eyes devoid of any warmth. "See to it." The new day was only a few hours away, and with it would come the fire that would consume everything. The key turning in the lock was a harsh, grating sound that scraped Nora out of a shallow, dreamless sleep. The cell door swung inward with a groan. revealing Sheriff Weller's bulky silhouette against the pale, dusty light of dawn. He looked tired and irritable, as if the entire unfortunate business was a personal inconvenience. "All right, you are out," he grumbled, not looking at her. "Mister, Carnes has decided not to press charges. He figures a night in jail is enough to have taught you a lesson about meddling in other people's affairs." Nora got to her feet, her body stiff from the cold, damp cot. She did not say a word, knowing that any response would only prolong the encounter. She walked past him, out of the cell, and through the small office. He did not look at her, but she could feel his hostile gaze on her back. She stepped out onto the porch of the jailhouse, which also served as the town's courthouse. The morning sun was weak, filtering through a high, thin layer of dust that never truly settled. The town was slowly coming to life. The blacksmith's hammer had begun its steady, rhythmic ringing, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon drifted from the small cafe down the street. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing in the air, feeling the relief of freedom mixed with the cold dread of what was to come. He was there, waiting. Caleb Hart stood across the street, leaning against a support post for the general store's awning. He was not looking at her, but she knew he was aware of her every move. He pushed himself off the post and started across the dusty street, his long strides even and unhurried. He had been released, too, likely with a similar warning. He stopped a few paces from her, his expression unreadable in the morning shadows, his eyes searching her face for any sign of fear or defeat. The day wore on, a long, tense stretch of hours filled with unspoken anxieties. Nora went back to the saloon, where Henderson looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect, and set her to the punishing task of scrubbing the entire floor on her hands and knees. It was hard, painful work, but she welcomed it. The physical exertion kept her mind from spiraling into a panic. She saw Caleb a few times, a distant figure moving with quiet purpose at the edge of town, talking to the blacksmith, then to a pair of young freighters. He was gathering his own kind of intelligence, laying his own kind of groundwork. By late afternoon, the sun had burned through the haze and now hung low in the west, casting long, distorted shadows across the main street. Nora had finished her work and had been dismissed for the day. She walked out of the saloon and, instead of going to her room, she walked back to the courthouse porch and sat on the top step, needing a moment to simply feel the solid wood beneath her and the warm sun on her face. A light breeze stirred, and from a nearby porch, the faint, metallic music of a wind chime drifted through the air, a delicate sound in a world of harsh noises. She did not have to wait long. She heard his footsteps in the dust and knew it was him before she looked up. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her, the setting sun at his back. The long hours of the day seemed to fall away, and it was as if they were back in the moment just after their release, the same questions hanging in the air between them. She looked at him, her gaze direct, her voice quiet but clear, stripped of all pretense. "I limp when I walk," she said. It was not an apology or a complaint. It was a simple, unadorned fact, the central truth of her life for the past year. She drew a slow breath, the words tasting of dust and weariness. "And I slow everyone down." Caleb did not answer immediately. He just looked at her, his eyes taking in the proud set of her shoulders, the exhaustion that she could not quite hide, and the unyielding strength that held it all together. He took a single, deliberate step up, then another, closing the distance between them until he was standing on the step just below her. He did not touch her, did not offer a comforting gesture. He simply stood there, his presence a solid and reassuring thing. A very faint, very rare smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I need a partner," he replied, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to come from the very ground they stood on. "Not a racer." The words settled over her, warm and unexpected. It was not pity. It was something far more valuable. It was acceptance. It was a statement that saw past the flaw, past the things she thought defined her, and saw the person he had come to rely on. A long, shuddering breath she did not know she was holding escaped her lips. The tension that had been coiled in her spine for a year began to unwind. A spark of her old, defiant wit flickered back to life. She gave a small, weary sigh. A partner gets half the reward, you know. His smile widened a fraction. I do not take rewards, he said, but I will share a slice of Mrs. Gable's peach pie with you, if she has any left. The offer was so simple, so unexpectedly gentle, that it almost brought tears to her eyes. She patted the spot on the step beside her, and he sat down. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sky shift from orange to a deep, bruised purple. The sounds of the town preparing for evening filled the air around them, the clatter of a water bucket being drawn from a well, the distant lowing of cattle in the stockyards, the murmur of voices from the hotel porch. Slowly, she leaned sideways, just enough for her shoulder to rest against his. The fabric of his buckskin shirt was rough against her cheek, and she could feel the solid warmth of him, a steady and calming presence. He smelled of pine sap, leather, and the clean, dry scent of the high desert. It was a simple, profound comfort, a moment of stillness in the heart of the storm. They were two solitary people who had found a rare and fragile anchor in each other. You are the brains, he said quietly, his voice a low vibration that she felt more than heard. The wires, the codes, the books. That is your territory. And you are the eyes, she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. The tracks, the trails, the things the rest of us never see. They were defining the terms of their alliance, an unspoken agreement that had been forged in shared danger and mutual respect. She was not the helpless female to be rescued, and he was not the lone hero riding to her aid. They were equals, each with a skill the other needed. So we have a deal, she said, straightening up slightly to look at him, though she did not move away. If you fall, I will help you up. He looked back at her, his gaze steady in the gathering gloom. And if you are slow, he finished, his voice solemn, I will wait. It was a vow, as binding as any made in a church. She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She looked down and, as if by instinct, her hand went to her left shoe. She discreetly bent her leg and pressed her fingers against the worn leather, feeling the slight lump of the folded paper inside. The copy of Carnes's secret ledger was still there, still safe. Caleb noticed the gesture, a flicker of understanding, mixed with a hint of admiration, crossed his face. Still in there? She nodded. The safest place I could think of. A walking safe, he said, the corner of his mouth twitching again. The phrase, meant as a joke, landed as a term of endearment. He saw her ingenuity, the way she had turned her greatest vulnerability into her greatest strength. The shared moment of humor, however, was pierced by a sudden, cold realization. Nora's expression sobered. It is not safe for long, she said, her voice dropping. Not if the safe is about to be thrown into a fire. Caleb went still. He understood at once. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Carnes had not let them go because Mary's threat had scared him. He had let them go because he considered them a minor nuisance, a loose end he could snip while he executed his real plan. He's going to burn it, Caleb said, the words flat and certain. The warehouse. He will destroy the ledgers, the cargo, everything. He will call it an accident and be on his way to Cheyenne before the ashes are cold. The quiet intimacy of the moment was gone, replaced by a surge of adrenaline, a cold, clear sense of purpose. The midpoint of their journey was not just this quiet commitment on the courthouse steps. It was the realization that their fight was far from over. It was about to begin in earnest. They both stood up at the same time. The sun had finally disappeared below the horizon, and the first lamp was being lit in the hotel window across the street. The lazy evening rhythm of the town suddenly sounded different. The blacksmith's hammer, now silent, had been a countdown. The rumble of a wagon down a side street was not just a delivery. It was a reminder of Carnes's power, of the clock that was ticking against them. They did not need to discuss a plan. Their purpose was singular, forged in the promise they had just made to each other. They had to stop the fire. They had to do it tonight. And they had to do it together. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a light. An unnatural, flickering orange glow began to bloom against the black canvas of the night sky, painting the undersides of the clouds in hellish hues. Then came the shouts, thin and scattered at first, then growing into a single, rising roar of alarm that ripped through the quiet evening. Fire! The cry went up from one end of the main street to the other. People spilled from the saloon, from the hotel, from their small clapboard houses, their faces pale and frightened in the pulsating light. The warehouse, Carnes's massive wooden tinderbox, was on fire. Flames were already licking their way up the western wall, greedily consuming the dry timber. A bucket brigade formed almost instantly. A frantic, desperate line of men and women stretching from the town well to the inferno. Caleb and Nora were in the thick of it, working side by side in the choking smoke and blistering heat. They heaved buckets of water onto the flames, a futile gesture against the growing blaze. Sheriff Weller was there, not helping, but directing, his voice a self-important boom over the crackle and roar of the fire. He moved through the crowd, his eyes scanning the chaos, and when he saw an opportunity, he seized it. He grabbed the arm of the blacksmith, a man whose opinion carried weight in the town. "I saw her," Weller said, his voice a conspiratorial bellow, "just loud enough for those nearby to hear." He pointed a thick finger toward Nora, who was stumbling back from the fire, her face smeared with soot, her eyes red from the smoke. The saloon girl. Saw her smoking a cigarette out back of this place not an hour ago. Careless, the wind must have caught an ember. The lie was simple, poisonous, and perfectly timed. In the panic and fear of the moment, it was an easy thing to believe. A scapegoat was a comfort, a simple answer to a terrifying event. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and suspicious, angry glances began to turn Nora's way. She felt the shift in the air before she fully understood the words. The camaraderie of the bucket line dissolved around her. People who had been her neighbors in the fight a moment before now edged away, their faces hardening. In the midst of this confusion, as all eyes were fixed on the consuming flames and the newly appointed villain, a hand clamped over Nora's mouth from behind, stifling her cry of surprise. A wiry, strong arm snaked around her waist, lifting her off her feet and dragging her backward, away from the light, into the deep shadows of the alley between the warehouse and the general store. It was Willie Pike. His face was a pale mask of grim purpose, his eyes glittering with a cold fire of their own. She struggled, kicking back with her heels, but he was surprisingly strong. He forced a foul-tasting gag into her mouth and, with brutal efficiency, tied her hands behind her back with a rough piece of rope. The roar of the fire, the shouts of the townspeople, all of it began to fade as he dragged her farther down the alley to where a horse and a small carriage stood waiting in the darkness. He threw her onto the floor of the carriage, jumped into the driver's seat, and with a sharp crack of the whip, sent the horse lunging into the night. Pike could not take the main trail south. It was swarming with people. He was forced to turn onto a narrow, winding track that clung to the side of the red bluffs overlooking the town. It was a treacherous path, rarely used, but it was his only way out. As the carriage bounced and rattled along the uneven ground, a new force entered the fray. The wind, which had been blowing steadily from the west, suddenly shifted, gusting violently from the north. It roared down from the high country, and with it, it brought the fire. The blaze, fanned by the new wind, exploded with a sound like a freight train. A massive wave of heat and a shower of glowing embers washed over the bluff. The horse, already spooked, screamed in terror and bolted, fighting the reins. Pike cursed, wrestling for control as the panicked animal galloped blindly along the cliff's edge. The carriage swayed violently, one wheel spinning perilously close to the long, dark drop. Back in the chaos of the town, Caleb had seen it all. He had seen Weller plant the lie, and he had seen the crowd turn on Nora, his ranger's eye, accustomed to seeing the small, significant detail in a wide landscape, had caught the flicker of movement in the alley. He had started that way, but by the time he got there, he was too late. All he found were the frantic, scuffed tracks in the dust and the fresh trail of a single carriage, heading for the bluffs. He did not hesitate. He ran to the livery stable, saddled his own horse with a speed born of years of practice, and galloped out of town. He did not need to see the carriage to follow it. The story was written in the dirt for him to read. He saw where the horse had lunged, its hooves digging deep, a sign of a sudden, violent start. He saw the uneven rhythm of the hoof prints, the way they bit into the earth at odd angles, telling him the horse was being driven hard and was fighting the bit every step of the way. He was not just following a trail. He was reading a narrative of fear and desperation. Inside the carriage, Nora was being thrown from side to side like a rag doll. The ropes bit into the raw flesh of her wrists. Panic was a cold, tight knot in her chest, but beneath it, the hard core of her will refused to break. She was not a victim to be rescued. She was a fighter, twisting her body into an awkward position. She began to work her bound hands, trying to get at the small, sharp hairpin she always wore tucked into the knot of her hair. Her fingers were numb, the ropes brutally tight, but she persisted, her mind a sharp, focused point of pain and determination. Finally, she managed to work the pin free, holding it between her teeth. She maneuvered it into her fingers and began the painstaking work of picking at the thick, knotted rope. The carriage took a sharp, lurching turn, and through the small, grimy rear window, Nora saw a stretch of trail ahead where the recent sandstorm had left a deep drift of soft, red sand at the base of the cliff. It was a chance, a terrible, desperate chance. With a final, frantic effort, she worked one hand free of the ropes. She did not wait. She scrambled toward the back of the small carriage, took a deep breath, and threw herself out into the darkness. She landed with a heavy, breath-stealing thud in the soft sand. The impact jarred her from head to toe, but the sand cushioned the fall. She lay there for a moment, stunned. The air knocked from her lungs, listening to the sound of the runaway carriage disappearing into the night. She had just pushed herself to her knees when Caleb's horse thundered into view, pulling up so hard that it sent a spray of sand and gravel across the trail. He was out of the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, his face a mask of grim relief as he knelt beside her. "Nora," he breathed, his hands hovering, afraid to touch her, as if she might break. "Are you hurt?" "I do not think so," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "Just winded." At that moment, the sound of the carriage returned. Pike had managed to get the horse under control and was coming back. He appeared at a bend in the trail, his face contorted with rage, the revolver in his hand a dark shape in the moonlight. Caleb pushed Nora behind him, drawing his own Colt in a single, fluid motion. "That is far enough." "Pike!" he yelled, his voice echoing off the rock face. Pike laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He raised his gun, but before he could fire, a fresh gust of wind sent a shower of fiery embers cascading down from the bluff above. The horse screamed again and reared violently. The carriage tilted, teetering on the edge of the precipice. Pike was thrown off balance, struggling to stay in the driver's seat and aim his weapon at the same time. In that chaotic moment, Caleb fired. The shot was deafening in the narrow pass. It was not aimed at Pike. The bullet splintered the wooden spoke of the carriage wheel right next to Pike's hand. The shock of the impact made him cry out and drop his gun. which went skittering over the edge of the cliff and into the darkness below, defeated and disarmed. Pike finally managed to calm his horse, turned the carriage around, and fled back toward the town. When they finally made it back, the fire was mostly out. A handful of the warehouse's support beams stood like blackened ribs against the dawn sky, and a pall of foul-smelling smoke hung over everything. The crowd was still there, a sullen, exhausted mob, their faces dirty and their tempers frayed. As Caleb and Nora walked into the circle of light, a new wave of anger rippled through them. "There she is," someone shouted. "It was Sheriff Weller, the one who started it all." The crowd surged forward, their exhaustion turning to rage. "Get her out of here," a woman shrieked. "She is bad luck. Banish her." They were closing in, a wall of hostile faces, and Nora felt a tremor of real fear. Caleb stood his ground in front of her, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered Colt, his face hard and unyielding, but he could not hold off a whole town. Then, a new voice cut through the clamor, quiet but carrying an authority that made people pause. "Enough." Mary Tour Feedethers stepped out of the crowd, her face calm and sad. She walked until she stood before them all. She looked not at Nora, but at the faces in the crowd, her eyes moving from one to the next. "I remember the winter of '76, she said, her voice clear and strong. "I remember when this town was hungry, and a man promised you food if you just looked the other way while his men took our land. You looked away, and the food that came was rotten. Some of you have forgotten that lesson." Her gaze finally came to rest on Silas Carnes, who stood at the edge of the crowd, watching with a detached amusement. "Fire does not start from tears," she said, her words a direct accusation. "And everyone in this town knows who has been making this valley weep." A shamefaced silence fell over the crowd. Mary's words had struck a chord, reminding them of a past they preferred to forget. In that moment of quiet, Caleb moved. He walked over to the smoldering ruins of the warehouse. One large shipping crate had fallen away from the main blaze and was only partially burned. He kicked at the charred wood, which fell apart, revealing the contents. Inside, nestled in blackened straw, was a heavy, rectangular mold for pouring gold ingots, and next to it, protected from the worst of the flames by the mold's metal bulk, was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages scorched and curled at the edges. Caleb picked it up and carefully opened it. Most of the pages were burned beyond recognition, but one entry was still partly legible, detailing a shipment of mining supplies and a payment of $5,000. He closed the journal. He did not show it to the crowd. He looked at Carnes, a silent promise in his eyes. "The circuit judge is due in Red Valley in 2 days, he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "I am sure he will be very interested in this." It seemed like a victory, a turning point, but just as a flicker of hope began to dawn, Sheriff Weller stepped forward, his confidence restored. He pointed a shaking finger at Caleb. "That does not change the fact that you," he declared, his voice ringing with false authority, "discharged a firearm in a dangerous and reckless manner tonight. Ranger or not, that is against the law. You are under arrest." Before anyone could react, Weller's 2 deputies, eager to reassert their authority, grabbed Caleb's arms. He did not resist. He handed the scorched journal to Nora as they led him away. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a sickly pale light over the ruined warehouse and the stunned, silent town. Silas Carnes watched Caleb being locked away, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. He turned to one of his men. "Have the wagon ready," he said quietly. "We leave for Cheyenne at first light." Nora was left standing alone in the smoky dawn, the precious, fragile evidence in her hand, the weight of the entire town's fate resting on her shoulders. Her partner was in jail, and their enemy was about to slip through their fingers for good. The gray light of dawn was cold and unforgiving, painting the smoldering ruins of the warehouse in skeletal shades of black and ash. Nora stood alone in the center of the dusty street. the scorched journal a heavy, fragile weight in her hands. Caleb was gone, swallowed by the jailhouse, and the silence he left behind was a deafening roar in her ears. She could feel the town's eyes on her, a mixture of suspicion, fear, and a weary desire for all this trouble to simply disappear. But it would not disappear. It was preparing to ride out of town on the back of Silas Carnes's freight wagon. She knew she had no time. The law, in the form of Sheriff Weller, was a tool in her enemy's hand. Justice was a word spoken by a circuit judge who was 2 days away. By then, Carnes and the gold would be a faint dust cloud on the horizon. All she had was a half-burned book, a secret hidden in her shoe, and the promise a man had made to wait for her if she was slow. Now, she had to be fast. Her first stop was Mary Two Feathers' small cabin. The Lakota woman was grinding herbs in a stone bowl, and she looked up as Nora approached, her eyes showing no surprise. She had been expecting her. "The ranger is caged," Mary said, her voice a simple statement of fact. "And the wolf is preparing to leave the valley," Nora replied, her own voice tight with urgency. "He will take the old trail through Wolverine Gulch. It is narrow, but it bypasses the main road. He will think no one knows it well enough to stop him." She unrolled a piece of butcher paper she had taken from the general store and, with a piece of charcoal, began to sketch a map. Her hands, so accustomed to the precise geometry of telegraphy, moved with a swift, certain purpose. She drew the sharp bend in the gulch, the steep, clay-lined walls, the single, wide clearing at its mouth. "Here," she said, pointing a soot-stained finger at the narrowest point. "This is where we have to stop him." "We?" Mary asked, her gaze steady. "I cannot do this alone," Nora said, "and neither can you. We need Mr. Peters, the blacksmith, and those 2 young freighters, the ones Carnes underpays. We need their strength. More than that, we need their courage." They found Peters by his forge, the fire banked but still glowing with a sullen heat. He was a big man, his arms corded with muscle, but his eyes were filled with a deep, weary caution. The 2 young freighters, barely out of their teens, were nearby, loading his wagon with supplies. Nora laid out the plan, her voice low and quick, showing them the scorched journal, explaining what she had copied from the black ledger. The blacksmith shook his head, wiping a hand across his sweaty brow. "Miss Quinn, that is madness. Carnes owns the sheriff. He has armed men. We are just working folks. What can we do?" "You can stand for something," Mary Two Feathers said, her quiet voice cutting through the men's hesitation. "You can stand for a town where the price of flour is not set by a thief and where your sons are not paid a slave's wage. Or you can stand for nothing and let the wind blow your dust away." The men were silent, their eyes downcast. Nora pressed her case. "I am not asking you to fight his men. I am asking you to help me build a wall. A wall of wagons and rope and people, just enough to stop him, to hold him until the circuit judge arrives." She looked from face to face. "He is counting on you being too afraid to act. He is counting on you standing for nothing." Slowly, the blacksmith met her gaze. He looked at his calloused hands, the tools of his trade, and a long, slow anger began to burn in his eyes. He gave a single, curt nod. The 2 young freighters looked at each other, then at him, and they nodded too. It was a small, fragile alliance, but it was a start. They made their way to Wolverine Gulch as the sun climbed higher, a small, determined band moving against the tide of the town's fear. As they reached the mouth of the narrow canyon, the sky, which had been a pale, hazy blue, began to curdle. Dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled up over the western bluffs with an unnatural speed. A cool wind sighed through the rocks, carrying the smell of ozone and wet earth. Then the rain came. It was not a gentle spring shower. It was a violent, high-country squall, a sudden, furious downpour that turned the air to a gray sheet. The dry, dusty ground drank it in for a moment, and then the water began to run. turning the red clay soil of the gulch into a thick, slick, treacherous mire. Nora looked at the churning mud, and a new, desperate idea took hold. This was not a hindrance. It was a weapon. "The wagons!" she yelled over the roar of the rain. "Get them into position." Across the narrowest point. They worked frantically in the deluge, the men straining to push Peter's heavy wagon and a smaller cart into the mud, turning them sideways to form a crude barricade. The clay sucked at the wheels, holding them fast. They did not have to wait long. Through the driving rain, they heard the rumble of Carnes's heavy freight wagon, the shouts of the drivers urging the mule team forward. It appeared around the bend, a massive, canvas-covered behemoth, with Willie Pike riding alongside, his head bowed against the storm. They saw the barricade and pulled up, their surprise turning to anger. Silas Carnes himself climbed down from the driver's seat, his face a thundercloud of rage. A handful of his armed men emerged from behind the wagon. At the same time, people from the town, their curiosity piqued by the strange exodus and drawn by the confrontation, began to gather at the mouth of the gulch, their faces pale and uncertain in the gray, wet light. Nora walked forward, alone, into the muddy space between the two sides. She was soaked to the skin, her dress clinging to her, but she stood tall, her limp barely noticeable in the thick mud. In one hand she held the scorched journal, and in the other, the folded piece of paper from her shoe. "This is as far as you go, Mr. Carnes," she said, her voice ringing out with a startling clarity over the drumming of the rain. Carnes laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "You in what army, girl?" "The Army of the Truth," she said. She unfolded the paper from her shoe. "This is a copy of your own private ledger. It lists a shipment of so-called farm equipment for May 12th, and another of mining supplies for May 21st. She held up the scorched journal. "And this is a page from your warehouse log, detailing a payment for that very same shipment of supplies. Except it was not supplies. Was it, Mr. Carnes? It was gold. It." While she spoke, a commotion started at the back of the crowd. Sheriff Weller was trying to push his way through, but he was met with a wall of silent, stubborn men. It was Peters and the freighters, their faces set like stone. From the jailhouse, Caleb emerged, his hands untied. The townspeople, emboldened by the blacksmith's stand, had demanded his release, and Weller, seeing his authority crumble, had been forced to comply. Caleb did not go to Nora. He moved to the side, his eyes on Pike. The two men began to circle each other in the mud, their long-standing animosity finally boiling over. They lunged, crashing together and falling into the slick red clay. A grunting, straining mass of violence. A gun fell from Pike's coat, landing in the mud, out of reach of either man. As the two men wrestled, Mary, Two Feathers, stepped forward and addressed the watching townspeople. "Look at this," she cried, her voice rising above the storm. "Look at what this man's greed has brought to our valley, mud and fire and lies. Are we a town that deals in lies, or are we a town that keeps its word?" The crowd was shifting, the tide of opinion turning. Carnes saw it. He saw his power, his carefully constructed empire of fear, dissolving in the rain. His face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred. He pulled a revolver from beneath his coat, his eyes wild, and aimed it directly at Nora. "You," he screamed, "this is all because of you." He fired. In that split second, Caleb, having thrown Pike aside, launched himself toward Nora. He shoved her hard, pushing her out of the line of fire. The bullet that had been meant for her heart struck him high on the arm, spinning him around. The force of the blow sent him stumbling backward, and the wild, second shot from Carnes's gun went wide. The bullet ripped through the canvas of the freight wagon, tearing a hole in the painted words on the side, obliterating the letters FREIGHTCO. It was as if he had shot his own name, his own brand, his own legacy. Carnes raised the gun again, ready to finish the job. But Nora was already moving. On the side of the wagon were coiled ropes, thick signal cords with flags used by the freight company. With the speed of a telegrapher connecting a circuit, she grabbed one of the ropes, yanked it free, and with a flick of her wrist, looped the end of it around Carnes's gun hand, pulling it tight. He roared in frustration, the rope trapping his arm against his side, the gun rendered useless. Her skills, the ones born of wires and codes, had saved a life. It was the final straw for Willie Pike. He scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of terror, his loyalty shattered. "Do not shoot!" he shrieked, holding up his muddy hands. "I will tell you everything. The gold, it is not even on the wagon. It is hidden, in a cave, just behind the bend in the gulch. I will show you." At that moment, a man on a fine horse rode into the clearing. He was an older man, with a stern face and the unmistakable air of authority. It was the circuit judge, arrived 2 days early, drawn by the reports of a fire and the rumors of a town on the verge of open warfare. He took in the scene at a glance: the barricade, the wrestling men, the armed standoff, the confession hanging in the air. He looked at Sheriff Weller, who was trying to make himself small at the edge of the crowd. Someone in the crowd held up a soggy envelope. It was the bribe money Carnes had paid the sheriff, which Weller had carelessly dropped during the fire. The judge's voice was like the crack of a whip. "Sheriff Weller, you are relieved of duty. Mr. Carnes, you and your men are under arrest." The rain began to soften, the roar lessening to a steady, quiet drumming. The tension broke. A collective sigh went through the crowd. It was over. Caleb sat heavily in the mud, his back against a wagon wheel, his face pale, his hand clamped over his bleeding arm. Nora knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she tried to examine the wound. He looked at her, his breathing harsh, a line of pain etched around his mouth. She looked into his eyes, her own filled with a fierce, protective light. "Do not," she said, her voice a low, intense whisper. "Do not you dare take your eyes off me." It was not a plea. It was a command, a promise, a partnership sealed in mud and rain and blood. There was no triumph in her expression, no joy of victory. There was only the quiet, profound relief of balance restored. The wagon with its false cargo was impounded. The sky began to clear in the west, and a watery, hopeful light filtered through the thinning clouds, washing the red mud of Wolverine Gulch clean. The rain washed the world clean, leaving behind the smell of wet dust and the clean, sharp scent of sage. In the aftermath of the storm, both natural and man-made, Red Valley began to find its footing on steadier ground. The makeshift trial was held not in the courthouse, which was too small and formal, but in the main room of the Red Garter Saloon. The tables were pushed against the walls, and the circuit judge, a man named Elias Thorne, whose stern demeanor concealed a deep and abiding respect for the law, sat behind the bar, which now served as his bench. It was a strange and solemn affair. The townspeople, who a day before had been a fearful mob, now stood in a quiet, orderly line to bear witness. Mr. Peters, the blacksmith, his face scrubbed clean but his hands still ingrained with the soot of his trade, spoke in a low, rumbling voice about the cross-headed nails he had used on Carnes's wagons, and the exorbitant prices he had been forced to pay for iron and coal. The two young freighters, their youthful faces set with a newfound gravity, testified to the secret cargo they had been paid to haul, and the threats they had received to keep their mouths shut. Then it was Nora's turn. She stood before the judge, not as a defendant or a victim, but as an expert witness. There was no tremor in her voice, no hint of the fear and exhaustion she had endured. She spoke with the calm, clear precision of a telegrapher transmitting a vital message. She laid out the evidence, the scorched journal, and the carefully copied page from the black ledger. She explained the substitution cipher, the commercial routing symbols, the way Carnes had used the mundane language of commerce to conceal a criminal enterprise. She did not speak of being kidnapped, or of the fire, or of the town's scorn. She spoke only of the facts, the cold, hard language of the ledgers. And in doing so, she built a case as strong and irrefutable as a line of steel rail. When she was finished, the judge called for Caleb. His arm was in a clean white sling, and there were dark bruises on his face from the fight in the mud, but he stood as straight and steady as a mountain pine. His testimony was a study in minimalism. He spoke of the tracks, of the meeting at Whitman's Ford, of the evidence of a planned arson. He did not embellish his own role, nor did he paint himself as a hero. He presented himself simply as an officer of the territory who had observed a crime in progress and taken the necessary steps to intervene. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man who lets the truth speak for itself. In the days that followed, a subtle but profound change rippled through the community. The town was looking at itself in a mirror for the first time in a long while, and it was not entirely pleased with the reflection. One afternoon, Henderson, the saloon owner, found Nora at the small cafe. He approached her table awkwardly, holding his hat in his hands, his face flushed with a rare embarrassment. He cleared his throat and mumbled something about her next meal being on the house, an unspoken apology that Nora accepted with a quiet nod. A few of the women who had shouted for her banishment during the fire crossed the street to offer clumsy, heartfelt apologies. Their eyes filled with a shame she did not wish upon them. Perhaps the most significant change came in the form of a shy, 17-year-old girl named Sarah, the blacksmith's daughter. She found Nora one evening as she was leaving the general store. "Miss Quinn," she began, her eyes fixed on the dusty ground. "Is it true, what they say, that you can make lightning talk through a wire?" "Something like that," Nora said gently. The girl looked up, her eyes shining with a fierce curiosity. Could you teach me in that moment?" Nora was no longer the limping outcast. She was a source of knowledge, a symbol of a new kind of power. The legacy of her struggle was not bitterness, but inspiration. Caleb's wound was clean, the bullet having passed straight through the fleshy part of his upper arm. Mary, Two Feathers, tended to it in her quiet cabin, applying a poultice of crushed herbs that smelled of damp earth and mint. Nora was there, her hands steady as she helped roll a clean bandage. As Mary worked, she looked at the healing wound, then at Nora's leg, and then at the lingering shadows in Caleb's eyes. "Every wound teaches us something," she said, her voice soft as moss. "A broken bone teaches the body to knit itself stronger. A cut teaches the skin to mend. The wounds you cannot see, they teach the heart to change its step, to find a new rhythm. You must both learn to walk with your new rhythms." She finished tying the bandage and looked at them, a deep, knowing approval in her gaze. They were two wounded people who were, together, learning to walk whole. Justice, when it came, was not a dramatic spectacle. It was a simple, procedural affair. A federal marshal arrived and took Silas Carnes and the now former Sheriff Weller away in a prison wagon. They did not rage or protest. They were simply two men whose power had evaporated, leaving them small and insignificant. Willie Pike, in exchange for his full and detailed confession, was given a reduced sentence. It was not a perfect justice, but it was a fair one, rooted not in vengeance, but in the restoration of order. The day after Carnes was taken away, Nora received another visitor. It was the postmaster, the same man who had dismissed her so callously just a short time before. He stood before her, his face a miserable shade of red, twisting his hat in his hands. He explained that the telegraph lines, damaged in the storm, needed to be repaired and the station put back in order. The railroad, on the judge's recommendation, had authorized him to offer her the position of interim telegrapher. Nora listened patiently. When he was finished, she looked him straight in the eye. "I will accept the position," she said, her voice even. "On one condition. I will need 2 apprentices, I would like to offer the positions to Sarah Peters and another young woman from the town. They will need to be paid a fair wage for their training." The postmaster blinked, taken aback, but he saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes. He nodded his assent. Nora was not just taking a job. She was building a future, ensuring that the door she had forced open would remain open for others to walk through. The newly formed town council, with Judge Thorne presiding, offered Caleb the position of town marshal. He listened to their offer, then respectfully declined. "I am a ranger," he said simply. "My place is on the trail." But then he surprised them. "However," he added, "I would be willing to serve as a trail security consultant for the town. I can spend a quarter of my time advising on routes, tracking stock thieves, and helping to keep the peace beyond the town limits." He was not a man to be tied down, but he was a man willing to forge a new kind of tie, a commitment to the community he had helped to heal. The effects of Carnes's downfall were felt almost immediately. With his monopoly broken, a competing freight company from Cheyenne began to run wagons into Red Valley. At the general store, the price of a sack of flour dropped by a full $1. The cost of coffee, sugar, and bacon followed suit. It was a tangible, measurable form of freedom, a victory that could be felt in the lightness of a coin purse and the taste of a less expensive meal. One evening, in the small, clean room behind the now functioning post office that the town had given Nora as her temporary quarters, she was trying to teach Caleb the basics of Morse code. He sat at her small table, a look of intense concentration on his face, tapping out a clumsy rhythm on an old cast-iron pot with a spoon. The sound was a discordant clatter, bearing no resemblance to the crisp, clean language of the telegraph key. Nora watched him, a smile playing on her lips. Finally, she could not contain it any longer. A laugh, a real, full-throated laugh, bubbled up from deep inside her. He stopped, looking up at her with a mock-offended expression. "What is so funny?" "That," she said, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye, "that is not Morse code. I am not sure if you are praying for rain or calling me to dinner." The easy, shared humor was a balm, a sign of how far they had come. Later that night, she performed one last private ritual. She sat on the edge of her bed and took off her left shoe. She carefully removed the insole and took out the folded, worn piece of paper that had been her secret weapon. The next morning, she placed it, along with the scorched journal, into a large manila envelope, which she sealed with wax and handed to Judge Thorne to be entered as official evidence in the federal case against Silas Carnes. The walking safe had completed its mission. That evening, as twilight settled over the valley, painting the red bluffs in shades of purple and rose, Caleb and Nora walked to the high point of land just east of town. His arm was still in the sling, and her limp was a quiet, steady rhythm beside his even stride. They were not healed, not perfect. They were simply themselves. Far to the east, over the distant Black Hills, a thunderstorm was putting on a silent, spectacular show. Flashes of lightning illuminating the towering cloud banks. They stood together, not speaking, watching the distant, beautiful violence of the storm. The air was cool and clean, and the silence between them was not empty, but full of a deep and unspoken understanding. They had weathered their own storm, and now, in the quiet aftermath, they had found a place of peace, a steady ground on which to stand, together. The weeks after the trial settled into a quiet, steady rhythm, like a river finding its natural course after a flood. Autumn came to the high country, painting the cottonwoods along the creek a brilliant, buttery yellow, and turning the air sharp and clean with the promise of coming cold. Red Valley was breathing again, a slow, deep breath of a town that had survived a fever. And Nora's life found a new center in the small, sunlit room behind the post office. The clatter of the telegraph key was a familiar, comforting music, a language she was now passing on to two eager students. Sarah Peters, the blacksmith's daughter, had a quick, intuitive grasp of the code. while the other girl, a quiet rancher's daughter named Emily, was slower but meticulously precise. Nora taught them not just the dots and dashes, but the responsibility that came with them, the knowledge that they were weaving the threads of a community together, one message at a time. Caleb was gone for days at a time, his work as a trail consultant taking him far into the surrounding territory. He would return quietly, his face weathered by the sun and wind, bringing with him the scent of pine and distance. He would never announce his arrival, but Nora would look up from her key and he would be there, leaning in the doorway, a silent, steady presence that had become the anchor of her world. It was on one of these evenings, as the sun was setting and casting the red bluffs in a soft, rose-colored light, that he came to her. The day's work was done, and she was tidying the office, the air smelling of ink and the oil from the big brass lamp. "There are some new survey markers on the East Trail," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to fill the quiet room. "They need checking before we lose the light." It was not a question, and it was not an order. It was a simple statement of fact, an invitation disguised as a practical task. Nora hung her apron on its hook and reached for her shawl. She understood. They walked out of town, leaving the sounds of evening, a dog barking, the distant laughter from the saloon behind them. They did not speak, falling into the comfortable silence that had grown between them. Their steps were a familiar, uneven rhythm on the dusty trail, his long, even stride, and her own softer, hesitant one. It was a rhythm of patience and acceptance, a kind of music only they could hear. He led her up a gentle rise to a place where the trail overlooked the entire valley. Below them, the town was a scattering of dark shapes, with the first yellow squares of lamplight beginning to appear in the windows. The sky was a vast, darkening canvas, streaked with the last fiery embers of the day. He stopped and turned to face her, in the soft, fading light. The lines on his face seemed to soften, and the usual watchfulness in his eyes was replaced by something warmer, something more vulnerable. He was not a man who was comfortable with grand gestures or flowery words. He was a man of the earth, of tangible, solid things. He reached into the pocket of his buckskin shirt and pulled something out. It was not a jeweler's box. It was a simple, braided loop of dark, worn leather, its surface smooth with age and use. He had unraveled a thread from an old saddle cinch, a piece of leather that had shared his long, lonely journeys, and braided it into a circle. Attached to the loop, gleaming softly in the twilight, was a small, crudely fashioned silver ring, hammered from a Mexican coin. He held it out to her on the palm of his hand. It was not a showy or expensive thing, but it was profoundly beautiful. She looked closer and saw that the surface of the silver band was not smooth. It was marked with a series of tiny, hand-carved notches and grooves. Her telegrapher's mind read them instantly. Dash dot, dash dot dash, N.C., Nora, Caleb. He saw the recognition in her eyes, and a slow, shy smile touched his lips. He let out a long, quiet breath, as if releasing a tension he had held for a lifetime. "I cannot promise to run fast," he said, his voice quiet but steady, each word carefully chosen, each one carrying the weight of a solemn vow. "I promise to wait, to be a trail partner, before I am a husband." Tears welled in Nora's eyes, hot and sudden, blurring the lights of the town below into a soft, shimmering haze. She looked from the ring to his face, at this quiet, steady man who had seen past her limp to the strength beneath, who had offered her not a pedestal, but a place by his side. She reached out and touched the small silver ring, its notched surface a confirmation of everything they had been through together. "I cannot promise to walk straight," she replied, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name, a mixture of joy and gratitude so profound it ached. Her own wit, the shield she had so often used, was now a gift she offered back to him. "But I promise to walk forward." He took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers, and slid the small silver ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Then he drew her gently closer, and they stood there for a long moment, their foreheads resting against each other, the world falling away until there was only the two of them, two solitary souls who had found their true north in each other. Their celebration, when it came, was as simple and honest as the proposal. There was no public announcement, no grand party. That evening, they walked to Mary Two Feathers' cabin, where a pot of thick, savory bean stew was already simmering over the fire. The blacksmith was there, along with his daughter Sarah and the two young freighters. It was a small, hand-picked family, a gathering of the people who had stood together when it mattered. They ate from tin plates, their conversation quiet and warm, their laughter genuine. It was a feast not of wealth, but of loyalty and community. Sitting by the fire, with the stars beginning to appear in the clear, cold sky, they began to plan their future. It was a practical, realistic future, built not on romantic dreams, but on a foundation of shared work and mutual respect. For half the year, during the harshest winter months when the high trails were impassable, Caleb would stay in Red Valley, helping to maintain order and plan the routes for the spring. During that time, Nora would run her telegraphy school, turning out a new generation of skilled operators for the other half of the year. While Caleb was out on his long patrols, she would manage the telegraph office, the vital link that kept the town connected to the outside world, and with the reward money that the town had insisted on giving them, they decided to establish a fund to build a permanent, stone-lined water station on the main trail, a gift to the weary travelers who, like Nora, had once arrived in the valley thirsty and in need of a safe harbor. The next day, a significant change came to the post office, with Mr. Peters' help. Nora took down the old, weather-beaten sign that hung over the door of the telegrapher's office. It was a small, rectangular piece of wood, its painted letters faded but still legible, "No women operators." She did not smash it or burn it. She simply set it aside, a relic of a past the town was leaving behind. In its place, she hung a new, freshly painted sign. Its message was simple and direct: "Learn Morse at Nora's." That evening, as she lit the big oil lamp in the office, its steady golden glow pushing back the shadows, she took the braided leather cord with its small, notched silver ring and hung it from a small brass hook on the lamp's base. The silver caught the light, the Morse code for their names a secret, shimmering promise in the warm glow. Their love and their responsibility, their private commitment and their public duty would shine together, a single steady beacon in the heart of the town. They had learned the most profound lesson the West had to teach that survival. And justice and love did not require you to be the fastest or the strongest. It did not require you to run. It only required you to walk forward, together. A year passed. The land, as if finally exhaling after a long and painful drought, began to heal itself. The rains that had begun with the fury of the squall in Wolverine Gulch gentled into a pattern of steady, life-giving showers. The Powder River ran full and clear, and for the first time in years, the grass on the high plains grew thick and green. The trails were safer, not just from the machinations of criminals, but from the desperation of hungry men. Red Valley lost its dry, hacking cough. The constant taste of dust was replaced by the smell of damp earth and the distant, clean scent of pine. Nora Quinn's world was measured by the steady, rhythmic pulse of the telegraph key. She now had 3 students, their different tapping styles as distinct as their handwriting. The post office had become a hub of quiet, focused activity, a place of learning and connection. Her limp was still a part of her, a gentle hesitation in her step as she moved between the telegraph desk and the front counter. But it was no longer the defining fact of her existence. It was simply a part of her story, a physical reminder of a past she had not just survived, but transcended. She moved with a confidence that had nothing to do with the perfection of her gait and everything to do with the certainty of her purpose. She had found her voice again, not just in the crisp language of Morse code, but in the easy, self-deprecating humor she shared with her students and friends. She never spoke of the fire or her night in the jail cell, but if someone new to town asked about her limp, she would smile and say, "It reminds me to take my time. There is no prize for getting there first." The self-pity that had been her silent companion for a year had vanished, replaced by a deep and abiding sense of peace. Caleb Hart had changed, too. The profound solitude that had once wrapped around him like a second skin had loosened its grip. He had learned the difficult art of trust, the quiet strength in relying on another person. He still spent weeks at a time on the high trails, reading the land's silent stories, but his returns to Red Valley were no longer just a pause for supplies. They were a homecoming. The townspeople, who had once seen him as a remote and intimidating figure, now greeted him with a nod and a genuine smile. They saw him not just as the ranger, but as Nora's husband, as the man who had helped them find their own courage. He had learned to laugh, a low, rumbling sound that was still rare enough to be a gift. Nora would hear it and feel a warmth spread through her chest, and he had learned to lean on her strength as she leaned on his. His revolver, which had once been a constant, grim weight on his hip, now often hung on a peg by the door of their small, tidy quarters behind the post office. He would go for days without touching it, his peace no longer dependent on the cold, hard promise of steel. The world beyond the valley, however, had not forgotten them. News came over the wire one afternoon that Silas Carnes, from his cell in the federal penitentiary in Cheyenne, was appealing his conviction. A tremor of the old fear rippled through the town, a reminder that evil, once vanquished, can still cast a long shadow. But the fear did not take root. Red Valley was no longer a town that could be cowed by a single man's ambition. They had faced their own weakness and found a collective strength. In a special election, they had chosen Mr. Peters, the blacksmith, a man of quiet integrity and strong hands, to be their new sheriff. They had learned to choose their own leaders, to forge their own laws, to be the masters of their own fate. The story of that tumultuous time settled into the town's memory, becoming a quiet legend whispered not in fear, but in pride. It was a story about freedom, not as a grand, abstract idea, but as the simple, practical right to a fair price for a sack of flour. It was about dignity. The right to walk through your own town with your head held high, regardless of your gender or the rhythm of your step. It was about justice, not as a sudden, vengeful act, but as a slow, deliberate process built on facts and courage and the willingness of ordinary people to speak the truth. And it was about a love that was not a prize for the perfect or the whole, but a quiet, steadfast partnership between two incomplete people who made each other strong. One late afternoon, as the sun was beginning its slow descent, Nora stood on the post office porch, watching a hawk circle in the clear, blue air above the red bluffs. A fine layer of dust, a memory of the town's thirsty past, had settled on the railing, partially obscuring the braided leather cord with its small silver ring that hung from the base of the big oil lamp just inside the door. As the lamplight flickered to life, it caught the silver, and for a moment, the tiny, hand-carved notches spelling their names, NC, seemed to glow with a life of their own, a silent, steady message of love and endurance. In the West, it was a hard-learned truth that victory did not always belong to the fastest gun or the swiftest horse. It belonged to those who were steadfast, to those who endured. The ripples of their actions had spread far beyond the valley. One day, a message came through from the telegraph station 2 stops down the line. It was a perfectly transmitted, flawlessly coded weather report. And at the end of the message was the operator's sign-off. It belonged to a young woman with braided hair who had been Nora's first student. In Red Valley, a mother who had once been among the loudest voices calling for Nora's banishment now walked her young daughter past the post office every day. And every day, She would point to the sign that read, "Learn Morse at Nora's," and she would smile, a quiet, respectful smile that spoke of a profound and lasting change of heart. The story did not end with a grand celebration or a dramatic finale. There were no fireworks, no ringing bells. It ended, as it had begun, with a quiet rhythm, that evening, as full darkness settled over the valley. Nora, Sty, and Caleb stood for a moment on the wooden porch of the post office, looking out at the peaceful, sleeping town. Then they turned to go inside. The sound of their footsteps on the worn wooden planks was the only sound in the cool night air. Two distinct rhythms. Two different steps, one slightly uneven. A gentle hesitation full of resilience and grace. The other long and steady. A quiet stride full of patience and strength merged and became one. They did not need to run. They walked together. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment below where in the world you are tuning in from to connect with each other. And please subscribe to Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can reach more listeners who love the West.